Welcome to The Debate. When archaeologists unearth an ancient structure, they don't just look at the physical dimensions of the walls or the depth of the foundations.
Right.
They're really looking at the architecture to understand the mind of the builders. Like if the columns are carved from marble with scenes of a harvest, you can safely infer a society that valued prosperity, civic pride, maybe some level of peace.
Yeah, it's an externalization of their internal state.
Exactly.
I mean, you look at Roman aqueducts and you see a culture completely obsessed with order, engineering, dominance over the natural world. Architecture is basically psychology in stone.
It is. But if the pillars are constructed from human femurs and the altar is this sprawling mosaic of shattered skulls?
You assume madness.
Right.
You assume a death cult.
Exactly. And that brings us to the architectural and psychological ruins of Danny Boyle's 2026 film, 28 years later, The Bone Temple. Today we are looking at this brutal cinematic world through a very specific psychological lens, internal family systems theory, or IFS.
Because after nearly 3 decades, the world of this film has moved way past the temporary panic of an initial viral outbreak. The characters aren't just scrambling to survive a weekend anymore.
No, their trauma has become a literal legacy. The environment has settled into this state of deep, toxic adaptation.
It's a fascinating and, frankly, a completely horrifying psychological landscape to unpack.
It really is. So the central question we're looking at today is this. Do the extreme psychological structures of the Bone Temple, this community where humanity literally ritualizes pain and death, do they represent a tragic state of stalled healing?
A vital question.
Right, because I look at the Bone Temple, and to me, this isn't a functional society. It's just one massive, terrified psychological defense mechanism trying to keep the lights on. I'll be arguing that it's a systemic failure, where the core human self has been completely lost.
And I come at it from a totally different way. I'll be arguing that viewing this as a, quote-unquote failure relies entirely on peacetime psychology.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in an environment where absolute lethal chaos is the baseline, building an extreme psychological shell isn't a failure to heal. It is the only logical, highly functional defense required to survive a world of permanent trauma.
Okay, well, before we get into the weeds of the film's climax and what survival actually means, let's make sure we're grounding this for anyone listening who might not be a clinician.
Good idea.
So, internal family systems, or IFS, is this brilliant psychological framework that essentially says your mind isn't just one unified thing. It's a family of distinct parts.
Right.
You have the core self, which is your capacity for compassion, curiosity, calm, and connection.
The ideal state of human flourishing, essentially.
Exactly. Then you have the exiles. Think of these like wounded children locked in a psychological basement. They carry all your pain, your shame, your profound trauma.
And because that pain is so overwhelming, your brain develops protective parts to make sure those exiles never get out, to make sure no one can ever hurt them again.
Precisely. And those protectors come in 2 flavors. You have managers, who are the proactive, ruthless security guards pacing outside the basement door.
Always on patrol.
Always. They try to control everything, your environment, your relationships, your emotions, just to prevent you from ever feeling vulnerable. If you're a perfectionist or a workaholic, that's often a manager part trying to keep you safe from criticism.
And then you have the firefighters. If the manager fails and the pain slips out, the firefighter reacts immediately and destructively.
Right.
It numbs the pain or distracts you at any cost. Addiction, rage, self-sabotage, that's firefighter behavior. It basically burns the house down just to kill the spider.
Which is a perfect framework for the world Danny Boyle built. Using that framework, my argument is that the community in the Bone Temple operates as one extreme collective manager system. And honestly, it is deeply pathological.
Pathological is a pretty strong word there.
Well, look at the text of the film. We are seeing a group of people who, instead of processing their profound pain and grief over the loss of the old world, have resorted to the absolute ritualization of their trauma.
But why call that pathological? Look at the actual mechanism of what they are doing.
I call it pathological because they have essentially frozen their emotions. They literally built a temple out of the bones of the dead, and they worship it to feel a false sense of control over a terrifying reality.
Right.
The core human self, their empathy, their connection, their peace, has been entirely obscured under this cold, pragmatic shell. They aren't living. They're just perpetually managing despair to keep the exiles hidden.
Let me jump in here, because I think we really need to look at the physiology of this.
Okay.
You are looking at a society that is literally keeping its people alive against a relentless, biologically engineered threat. And you're diagnosing them with a failure to process their grief. I mean, come on.
I am, because they are failing to process it.
But think about the physical mechanism of panic. The human nervous system simply cannot sustain a state of pure panic, meaning spiked cortisol and adrenaline, for 28 years.
True. The body does have to adapt to survive.
Exactly. If you stay in a state of active panic, your heart gives out, your immune system crashes, your brain physically degenerates. You die. Ritualization is the psychological and physiological mechanism required to downgrade an active terminal threat into a manageable routine.
So you think building a temple of skulls is just a healthy routine?
To you, yes, it looks like a frozen cold shell. To them, it's the only way to stop their nervous systems from burning out completely. After 28 years, this fossilization of protective parts isn't a tragic misstep. It is a necessary biological and cultural evolution.
But at what cost? At the cost of their actual humanity?
At the cost of survival, which is the only metric that matters here. Consider the actual threat outside the walls. The rage virus, as it's described in the material, is essentially a biologically induced 100% activated firefighter part.
Right, pure rage.
It wipes out the self, it wipes out the manager, and it responds to any stimulus with pure, unadulterated violence. Against pure, chaotic violence like that, a rigid, extreme manager system like the Bone Temple is the only viable counterbalance. The loss of the self isn't a tragedy in this context. It is a pragmatic, required sacrifice for the continuation of the species.
I struggle with this part of your argument so much. Walk me through how a clinician, or anyone for that matter, looks at a society that has normalized absolute misery and sees success.
Because they are alive.
Let me offer an analogy to explain why I think this adaptation is actually killing them from the inside out.
Go ahead.
Building the Bone Temple is exactly like putting a plaster cast on a broken bone. In the immediate aftermath of the fracture, the initial outbreak, 28 years ago, that rigid cast is absolutely necessary. It stabilizes the system. If you try to walk on a fresh break, you destroy the leg entirely.
Right. The cast is a life-saving intervention. We agree on that.
But if you leave a plaster cast on for 28 years, it atrophies the muscle underneath. The skin rots. The limb becomes functionally useless.
Okay, but
Wait, let me finish the thought. The source material leads us straight to this conclusion. When a society can't unburden its trauma, when it can't take the cast off and do the painful physical therapy of feeling its emotions again, it builds a temple to that burden and falsely calls it culture. That is stalled healing. It's a defense mechanism that has outlived its utility and become a prison.
I have to push back on that. Hard. The cast analogy completely ignores the reality of the character's environment.
How so?
You take a cast off because the environment around the patient is safe enough for the bone to heal and function normally again. You go to a safe home, you do your exercises. In Boyle's world, the patient is still standing in the middle of an active minefield.
But they've built walls.
The environment is still actively swinging a sledgehammer at those bones every single day. The threat hasn't passed. It has merely stabilized into a permanent state of siege. You don't take the cast off just because the skin underneath is getting itchy.
But they are actively worshiping the sledgehammer. That's what the ritualization is. They aren't just enduring the violence, they're venerating the trauma.
They are ritualizing it to make it comprehensible. Look, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, of course they built a bone temple, what else could they do? You have to look at the psychological toll of uncertainty. Unpredictable violence destroys the mind much faster than predictable violence.
True.
By ritualizing the death around them, they transform unpredictable horror into a predictable religion. It's a coping mechanism, yes, but it works. And we really have to talk about the concept of legacy burdens from the text.
Yes, the generational aspect of this trauma.
Exactly. This isn't just about the survivors of the initial outbreak anymore. We have a younger generation represented so brilliantly by Jodie Comer and Aaron Taylor Johnson. They were born into this reality.
Right.
In IFS, a legacy burden is a trauma or a protective belief passed down through a family line. This younger generation inherited these aggressive, hypervigilant protector parts from their parents as a default instinct.
They didn't choose it.
No, they didn't. To them, this isn't a defense mechanism masking a healthier alternative. It literally is their culture. They have no concept of a self-led world to return to. You can't atrophy a muscle you never developed. For Comer and Taylor Johnson's generation, the manager system is their baseline anatomy.
I see your point about the generational inheritance and how deeply ingrained it is, but let's look closer at that baseline anatomy.
Okay.
Because the brilliance of Danny Boyle's film is how it forces us to look at two sides of the exact same psychological coin. You have this stark dichotomy between the infected outside the walls and the temple dwellers inside.
The two extremes.
Right. You accurately describe the infected as pure, chaotic firefighters. They react to the overwhelming pain of the virus with blind violence. And on the other side, we have the temple dwellers, who are extreme managers, enforcing rigid, draconian control over every aspect of their existence to prevent the pain from surfacing. But structurally, they are identically tragic.
Identical? I mean, come on. One group is tearing people limb from limb in a blind rage, and the other is maintaining a cohesive, albeit grim, agricultural community. How are those identical?
They are identical in their internal mechanism, because in both groups, the self is completely dead. Whether you are consumed by the chaotic fire of the rage virus or frozen in the absolute ice of the Bone Temple's rituals, the result is the exact same: the complete absence of human compassion, curiosity, and connection. They are two different strategies for avoiding the exact same vulnerability. The managers and the firefighters have both staged a coup against the self. The people inside the temple are just as trapped by their protectors as the infected are.
I really don't buy that equivalence. You are equating the absence of the self with a failure of the system. I look at how these protective parts manifest in reality.
Which is violently in both cases.
But with different aims. The infected represent an absolute, catastrophic loss of control. It's pure biological id. The temple dwellers, however, use their manager parts to deliberately prevent humanity from having to face its true weakness.
By building walls of bone.
Yes, the ritualization of the bones, that conscious decision to say, if we make this death into a religion, we no longer have to fear it, that is a magnificent feat of psychological engineering.
It is a delusion, a massive collective delusion that stops them from actually living.
It's a functional delusion, and I really have to question the underlying assumption you're making here. You're assuming that the self, with its inherent compassion, calmness, and clarity, has any actual utility in a world governed by the rage virus. Let's play this out realistically.
Okay, let's play it out.
What good is curiosity when a horde of infected is breaking down your gates? Curiosity gets you bitten. What good is compassion when the person in front of you is a 100% activated firefighter whose only drive is to destroy you? Compassion gets your entire community wiped out.
But
the manager system steps in and suppresses the self because the self would literally get them killed.
the utility of the self is that it is the only thing that makes surviving worth it. Without it, you aren't saving humanity. You're just extending the biological lifespan of meat.
Wow.
And the film itself proves that the manager system is ultimately unsustainable. It cannot last forever. Let's look at the climax, the literal and psychological collapse of the Bone Temple.
The moment everything falls apart.
Exactly. When those bone walls physically fall, it brilliantly demonstrates that the manager system was ultimately rigid and brittle. It couldn't adapt to a changing threat. And according to the text, what happens psychologically when the walls are breached?
Well, the system breaks.
Right. And the exiles that had been trapped behind those walls for 28 years finally fled out.
Their repressed emotions break through.
Yes. The profound sadness, the paralyzing grief, the desperate longing for the families they lost decades ago, it all hits them at once.
And it is absolutely terrifying to watch. It's sheer pandemonium.
It is overwhelming, yes. But I argue this collapse is absolutely necessary. It provides the only opportunity for these characters to finally unblend from their survival parts.
Unblend?
Yeah. In IFS, blending is when a part takes over your mind so completely that you forget you are anything else. For 28 years, these people have been entirely blended with their managers. They thought they were the cold, ruthless protectors.
Right.
When the system breaks, they are forced to confront their exiles. And confronting that pain is the first and only step toward rediscovering the true self. The collapse of the temple isn't just a physical disaster. It is the agonizing, necessary breaking of a 28-year fever. It's the stalled healing finally restarting. They are finally feeling something.
Okay, wait, let me stop you there. Are you seriously saying the destruction of their entire safety apparatus is, what? A triumph of the human spirit?
I'm saying it's the prerequisite for them to actually be human again. You can't heal until you acknowledge the wound.
I think you're falling into a trap that the source material specifically warns about. Think about the audience psychology mentioned in the text. The film actively attacks the audience's own manager parts while we watch it.
Walk me through that. How is the film attacking the audience?
As viewers, our internal managers desperately want to believe what you are arguing right now.
That healing is possible.
We want a narrative resolution. We want to believe that kindness survives in adversity. We want to look at the collapse of the bone temple and say, finally the healing can begin, the exiles are released, compassion will return, the fever breaks.
Because it gives us hope.
Right, because that narrative makes us feel safe. It wraps trauma in a neat bow. But the horror of the bone temple isn't built on jump scares or gore. The true horror is the sickening realization of how easily human beings will normalize absolute brutality to avoid feeling pain.
The normalization of the unacceptable.
Exactly. We adapt to hell and we call it home. So when those bone walls come down and the exiles flood out, that influx of repressed emotion is not a triumphant return to healing. It is a terrifying, lethal exposure.
Oh, wow.
After 28 years of a protective shell, sudden unblending doesn't make you enlightened. It leaves you defenseless in a world that is still incredibly hostile. The film is forcing us to watch people lose the only psychological armor that was keeping them alive. And it frames that loss as a tragedy, not a liberation.
But if the armor has essentially killed the person inside, if it has suffocated the self entirely, what are you actually protecting? A breathing corpse? This brings us to a really fascinating tension in the material.
It does.
We are looking at a masterwork that uses the polarization of the human psyche as its core narrative engine. On one side, we have the catastrophic, externalized violence of the firefighters, the rage virus. On the other, the cold, internalized, ritualized control of the managers, the bone temple. They are two extreme responses to the exact same trauma.
And I think we definitely align on the profound, devastating impact of those legacy burdens. The dark reality of passing down these extreme survival mechanisms to a new generation.
Yeah.
When the youth inherit the armor as their literal skin, the definitions of pathology and culture begin to blur entirely. To Aaron Taylor Johnson's character, taking off the armor isn't healing, it's flaying himself alive.
They really do blur. And that is the ultimate, lingering question posed to the listener by Danny Boyle's vision. We like to think we watch movies like this from a safe distance, but the film offers a terrifying mirror to our own real-world coping mechanisms.
Absolutely.
We all have traumas. We all have exiles we lock away and managers we employ to keep the basement door shut. It asks us directly, if you were forced to live in that kind of hell for 28 years, what would happen to your mind?
Yeah.
Would yourself, your compassion, your curiosity, your fundamental humanity somehow manage to survive the relentless assault? Or would your psyche entirely rely on judgment to maintain order and apathy to stop the pain?
It forces us to ask whether we would build our own temple out of the things that terrify us most, just to avoid feeling the terror. Would we construct a religion out of our own trauma just so we wouldn't have to process it?
Precisely. Which psychological force would ultimately prevail in the ruins of your own mind? The answer isn't clean, and the source material leaves us with profound complexities to untangle. We want to thank you for joining us for this discourse. There are many more layers to uncover in the architecture of this world, and we leave it to you to decide.
When the dust settles and you look at the pillars of your own psychological defenses, what kind of temple are you building?